couple of works in the West and Central Asia curriculum, the first of which is the Kaaba. So Kaaba is Arabic for cube. So this work is pretty self-explanatory in this regard. So you've probably talked about the Kaaba before when you've talked about Islam in your world history courses. So if you recall from that course, Mecca is considered the spiritual center of Islam, the city of Mecca, and the Kaaba is its most holy and sacred site within the city. So the Kaaba embodies two of the five pillars of Islam. These are the five tenements of the religion that people must follow. So one of them is to pray towards Mecca 5 times a day, and then another is to, at some point in time in your life, if you are physically and financially able to do so, to embark on the Hajj or pilgrimage to Mecca. So pilgrimages are fairly common religious practices. We see them in Buddhism and Christianity as well, and to some extent we see them in Judaism. So this is a fairly common thing that we have seen in a lot of world religions. So what pilgrims do when they arrive at the Kaaba is that they are supposed to circumnavigate or walk around the Kaaba. We also see this practice, interestingly, in Buddhism, which we'll cover in a couple of days. So this site is extremely famous and extremely holy in the Muslim world, and it is visited by over 1 million Muslims every year over the span of about 5 days. So the Kaaba was actually in the news recently because the Hajj had to be severely restricted this year due to COVID-19. One of the things that a lot of people do when they get to the Kaaba is that they try to touch the black stone, which is this kind of like structure on the Kaaba that was part of its original foundations that was said to have been given to Ibrahim, who was one of the original architects of the Kaaba, by the Archangel Gabriel. So it's considered kind of like a relic that's a part of the structure. So if everybody, and we're talking like 1 million people are touching the same stone, you can imagine that's going to be pretty cataclysmic in terms of spreading germs. So that's one of the reasons, that in addition to the close quarters. These are some contextual images that I've included in the slides just to give you a sense of how crowded this place gets during the pilgrimage. All of these little dots right here are people's heads. One of the things that a lot of people do when they embark on the Hajj is that they wear white, and they're oftentimes very frugally dressed to represent sort of like modesty and frugality. So that's one of the reasons why most of the people in this scene are dressed in white. So, as I mentioned previously, the Kaaba was said to have been built by Ibrahim and Ishmael, who in Christian theology are Abraham and Ishmael, though only a small portion of the original structure survives, which, as I mentioned previously, is the black stone. So the story behind the significance of the Kaaba goes back to the Prophet Muhammad, as most things do in Islam. So the Prophet Muhammad was driven out of the city of Mecca and forced to go to Medina, one of the neighboring cities. He was chilling out there for a couple of years, and then he went back to Mecca, and upon his return, he cleansed the Kaaba of the pagan idols that the people who had been in the city for a while had placed there. So they had kind of like desecrated the site, and he reclaimed the Kaaba and Mecca for Muslims. This is considered the beginning of the Islamic calendar. So the structure, of course, as you can imagine, has been repaired and received lots of maintenance over the centuries. The space around the Kaaba has been expanded several times and has actually been converted into a mosque. The complex is around 40 acres as of 2000, which is just incredibly large. And again, to give you a sense of the scale and scope of this complex, these are all people that have gathered for the Hajj right here. There's also been some modifications to repair and rebuild the structure after conflicts. There was one point in time when the original structure, which was made out of wood foundations, was actually burned down. The structure nowadays is made out of granite, so it's a little bit more difficult to burn down. So every single year, the structure's tapestry or the kiswa is replaced. There's this kind of like elaborate gold and silver embroidery that goes around the silk right here. The door on the Kaaba is also made of solid gold. When you go onto the interior of the Kaaba, it's like a tiny little prayer room. Not very many people are allowed to go in there. I believe it's the Saudi Arabian royal family and maybe a couple of other people that are allowed to go in there. Our next piece is the Dome of the Rock, or Qubat al-Sakra. So this is one of the first Islamic buildings ever made. You'll notice that the date is really early. We have Islam kind of beginning as a religion in the mid 600s with the Prophet Muhammad. So one of the interesting things about this building is that even though it's an Islamic building, it is not considered a mosque. It was actually commissioned by an Umayyad caliph as a religious focal point for his supporters. At this point in time, after Muhammad's death, there was a lot of civil war in this region, and a lot of different people were kind of vying for power. So this particular caliph did not at this point in time have control of the city of Mecca or the Kaaba, which at that point in time was considered, again, like the center and like the holiest site in Islam. So he basically made his own holy site, or designated his own holy site, to kind of divert power and influence away from Mecca and to kind of provide a place for his followers to gather. So in this way, he was very strategic about being like, okay, this site is also important. I'm going to build a complex here to emphasize its importance and to divert power away from my rivals. So what's super interesting about this location is that it is significant to 3 Abrahamic faiths, and this particular structure is intended to celebrate the holy ground beneath it. So in Christianity, this is supposedly the rock where Abraham nearly sacrificed Isaac. In Islam, it is where Muhammad embarked on his night journey. This is a passage that basically explains Muhammad's ascent to heaven. And in Judaism, this is the rock from which God created the world, and is regarded as a Temple Mount. This is also the site where the first, and I believe the second, Jewish temples were constructed. So it is a really significant holy site in 3 of these major Abrahamic religions. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of kind of conflict and controversy as to who the site belongs to. I've had a couple of Jewish students report that they weren't allowed to actually enter the Dome of the Rock when they visited Jerusalem. So to this day, it continues to serve as a pilgrimage site. What's super interesting about the Dome of the Rock is that the shape and the size of the building is very similar to a lot of the martyriums that were being constructed in the Christian world at the time. So you might remember San Vitale, which is one of the buildings that we covered in late antiquity, early Byzantine. It was that octagonal building. This building is also kind of octagonal. It has 8 sides. There's also the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is also located in Jerusalem, and this is the site that was built to enclose the tomb of Christ. It is thought that the Dome of the Rock was very much intentionally built to resemble the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and to kind of outshine it. You have this glittering dome on the exterior and these beautiful mosaic tiles. I believe that some of these tiles have been restored relatively recently in history. There's also this ornamentation and tile work on the inside. Of course, because this is a holier site, you're not going to see any human or animal imagery, but you do see a lot of kind of vegetal motifs, so plants, and then there's also a lot of calligraphy. The calligraphy tends to focus on the importance of seeing Allah as the one true God. There is also a somewhat petty passage that is included that basically says that Christ is not God, but he is a prophet, which is probably intended to snub the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is nearby, and all of the kind of tenements to Christianity that are in the area. When you're all sharing one city, you kind of have your petty rivalries. You have to get along, but you poke at each other in certain ways. So some of the wall mosaic calligraphy in here contains some of the oldest surviving Quran verses, and this is the first known building to have integrated such verses in the architecture itself. This, of course, would go on to be an overarching trend in a lot of Islamic buildings, including mosques, where we have the word of God literally being integrated into the architecture, usually through mosaics. So another one of those things that indicates this building as Islamic in nature are these striped voussoirs in the arches right here. So whenever you see these alternating colors, that is usually architecture that is associated with Islam in some way, shape, or form. Interestingly, there have been several temples and like other holy sites that were built on this particular location. So of course we have the Jewish temples that were built here. And after the second Jewish temple was destroyed, the Romans actually built a temple on top of that. And it's thought that these columns right here, these little Corinthian columns, were actually taken from the Roman pagan temple and then used in the construction of this one. So we have spolia definitely coming into play for this building, which is fairly common, especially when everybody wants to build a building in the same spot. So this is a review of some basic mosque vocabulary. Again, we talked about some Islamic work last semester, but if you needed a refresher, the terms that are highlighted are perhaps the most important to remember as we move forward. We're going to be covering a couple of other mosque architecture terms as we move forward as well. I'm trying to integrate them as organically as possible so that you're not completely overwhelmed. But to just give you a general recap, usually mosques have at least two portions. There's usually an outside portion that contains an ablution fountain. You have to wash your hands and feet before you enter the holy space. And then in the interior, you usually have the haram, which is the gathering space. Typically, people will lay out their prayer rugs here. And then the mihrab is the niche in the wall that is pointing towards Mecca, which is that, again, that city that contains the Kaaba, which is the holiest site in Islam. Minarets are usually placed on the exterior of mosques, or they're integrated into the walls, and they are places where people are called to prayer. They oftentimes, in some cases, are also serving as decorative ornamentation. So the first mosque that we're going to be covering in this part of the unit is the Great Mosque of Isfahan, which is in Iran. It's also known as Masjid-e Jameh, or the Friday Mosque. So a smaller mosque existed in this location around 700 CE, which you'll recall is really close to the foundation of Islam as a world religion. But several expansions have been made over the course of the centuries, starting around 1000, and there were even some renovations that were made as recently as the 20th century, which is really recent. So a lot of these changes were made to accommodate the growing population in Isfahan and to fit the needs of the Ummah, or the Muslim community. So a lot of large cities with primarily Muslim populations have some sort of congregational mosque, and in a lot of cases it is literally in the heart of the city. It is serving as the beating heart of the city, and a lot of things are built around the mosque. In this particular case, there's actually this sprawling market area on the exterior, and this mosque was actually considered like a place that was kind of like an interruption in the hustle and bustle of the city. There's only one entrance to the mosque that is open to the public nowadays, but there used to be 4 entrances and exits, and you could get to lots of different parts of the city by going through the mosque. So what you'll notice about this mosque that's different from a lot of the other ones that we've covered is that we're not having like a courtyard and then we have the interior. Instead, we have the courtyard that's centered in the middle right here, and then we have these buildings that are kind of flanking the central space. This is something that is relatively unique at the point in time when this mosque is being built. And there's a couple of things that are constructed in line with this kind of plan here. So one of those things are Iwan, which are these large arched doorways that are flanking entrances to the interior of the mosque right here. So there are 4 Iwan, or gateways, in this particular mosque, and each of them looks completely different. The most important Iwan right here is the Qibla Iwan. This is the one that is most highly decorated and ornamented, and it has 2 minarets flanking it. This is the direction that is pointing towards Mecca right here. So what you'll also notice in this courtyard view right here is that there is this flower-shaped ablution fountain. So again, a place where you would wash your hands and feet before you enter the holy space. So in the bottom center right here, we have an E1 gateway that was used for the Sultan and his attendants' private use. You can see that it's heavily ornamented, has this beautiful array of tiles that have been used to decorate the space, and then these unique niches that have been cut out of the archway to add some additional designs. This is an interior right here of the Great Mosque. This is a pretty traditional looking mihrab right here, or little niche pointing towards Mecca, and then a minbar, which is basically a pulpit, the place where the imam sits. This is an aerial view of the Friday Mosque to give you a sense of like this is the courtyard, and then these are all the buildings and complexes surrounding it. Again, this building has had things added to it over the centuries, so it's kind of like grown in fits and bursts, which is why it's somewhat uneven. Here's another view right here of one of those E1. This video has a really good kind of like summary view of all the kind of like significant locations within the Friday Mosque. So I'm going to go ahead and play it.
This mosque, with its elaborate decorative flourishes, encapsulates the beauty of Persian architecture. Paragon of Persian architecture, Masjid-e Jameh of Isfahan. In the 17th century, Isfahan enjoyed a golden age as the capital of the kings of Persia. Passing through its famous bazaar, filled with countless stalls, brings us to the entrance to the Friday Mosque. The Friday Mosque gets its name because it is the area's major center for Muslim Friday prayers. This is the oldest standing mosque in Iran, first built in the 8th century. Construction continued for 1,000 years, turning it into an embodiment of Persian architecture. The iconic feature of the mosque is its enormous arched, open-sided rooms called E1. There are 4 of them on the north, south, east, and west sides of the mosque. The way these E1 face each other creates an elegant architectural composition. Inside the mosque, there are numerous prayer halls dating from many eras. The oldest is this one, made of brick, which goes back to the 11th century. All of the arches and ceiling domes were constructed using unmortared brick. Down through the ages, the prayer halls became more and more ornate. This is a mihrab, which indicates the direction of Mecca. Its intricate design, executed in plaster relief, makes it one of the great artistic treasures of Iran. Next to this carefully preserved ancient prayer hall is one where worshippers pray to Allah each day. In the 16th and 17th centuries, when Persian arts were at their zenith, the E1 were given elaborate decoration. Their walls are covered by sumptuous, intricate designs. The tile work completely covers the walls. Each bit was hand-shaped by artisans using hammers and then assembled piece by piece. These geometric floral patterns are called Arabesques. And this is calligraphy in the Arabic script. Persian art developed on these lines because of the Islamic prohibition on icons and idol worship. The decoration of the Iwan is meant to remind the faithful of eternal paradise. After 1,200 years, the Friday Mosque still stands, a dazzling monument that echoes with prayers of the faithful.
I always love that video because it shows just the incredible amount of detail in the mosaic tile work. It's just mind-boggling. Speaking of amazing mosaic tile work, we are now going to be moving on to Taj Mahal, which is a structure that you are probably all familiar with in some way, shape, or form. So this particular building was commissioned by Shah Jahan, a Mughal Shah, in memory of his wife Mumtaz Mahal, who died in childbirth while giving birth to her 14th child. Don't stop till you get enough. So this was also intended to serve as a demonstration of his power and the courtly splendor of his reign, as well as this concept of paradise on earth. So Agra, where Taj Mahal is located, which is kind of like in northern central India, was regarded at that time as a riverfront garden city. It was really flourishing and wealthy because of the amount of trade that was able to be fielded through there. You also have close access to a waterway, which is something that is oftentimes foundational to a successful civilization. One important thing to remember within the context of Islam, and one of the reasons that I covered this artwork in this unit rather than when we cover India, is because of the importance of the concept of the garden in Islam. Oftentimes, gardens are associated with paradise, eternal bliss, and perfection that one is able to go into after they die if they have been good. So similar to kind of heaven in Christian theology. So the arrangement of plants and canals within this complex may have actually been constructed to resemble heaven in the Quran. The evidence on this is kind of fuzzy just because the way that the plants were arranged is not original as it was almost 400 years ago, so some of the landscape architecture might have changed since then. However, there is a lot of speculation that suggests that these gardens were specifically constructed to look like the way that like heaven is supposed to look in the Quran, or the concept of heaven. So the interior floor plan uses the 8 levels principle, which is also intended to resemble the 8 levels of paradise. So we see this theme repeated throughout. This is essentially an extremely elaborate tomb complex. So both Shah Jahan and his wife Mumtaz Mahal are buried in a room located under the central dome right here. This is the room, and we have these 2 cenotaphs right here that represent Shah Jahan and Mumtaz Mahal, and their remains are actually buried in the floor underneath in a separate burial chamber. So what you'll notice about this building is its extremely impressive and extensive use of white marble. White marble in this particular region was heavily associated with purity. It was rather unusual to have a structure of this size be constructed of marble, given how expensive it is and how it would oftentimes have to be brought in from quarries many miles away. The marble that was used for this particular structure was actually carted in from 250 miles away, which is astounding. So given its expense and the rarity, it was oftentimes used for like hierarchically more important things. So usually in the usually for holy spaces or for the burial chambers of religious officials, for example. One of the more common stones that was used for buildings in this particular region in Mughal India was red stone, usually a red limestone. It was used for more kind of like utilitarian functional buildings, usually forts and military buildings. Red usually symbolized the warrior class. What's super interesting when you look at this complex is that you have this gleaming white building, and then on the other side right here we have these 2 red buildings that are kind of flanking it, and then there's this red stone entrance kind of like at this end of the garden right here. So there's kind of almost this notion that these buildings are flanking and protecting this kind of holy jewel that's kind of nested inside and flanking the side of the river. So, There is an incredible amount of inlay work, particularly with tiles on both the exterior and the interior of the building. This is just a taste of the extent to which this building is just heavily ornamented. A lot of the stone that was used to create these tiles is actually precious and semi-precious in nature. There's lots of lapis lazuli, carnelian, and so on that was used. So very, very expensive to create this. What you'll notice when you look at this complex is that it's very symmetrical. We see a lot of this repetition of arches and domes. There's a sense of visual harmony that is intended to be created here. Interestingly as well, we have the structure flanked by minarets. These minarets, of course, are not serving as much of a religious purpose. Rather, they're intended to be like a more secularized aesthetic design that is intended to kind of frame this complex. Another kind of additional feature of this complex was the plinth or platform that it was built on top of. So it's actually elevated above ground level, and that was probably to make it seem even taller than it actually was. When you look at the interior right here, you're seeing this very kind of like orderly, radially symmetrical orientation. We're going to be seeing a couple of structures when we cover Hindu and Buddhist architecture that have similar constructions to this. And last but certainly not least, we're going to be going back in time a little bit to around 2,500 years ago to the Treasury and Great Temple of Petra. So Petra was the central city of the Nabataans, and the Nabataans were nomadic people that established lots of caravan routes around what is now called the Arabian Peninsula. So the Nabataans were extremely wealthy, and they were able to achieve this wealth through the sale of incense. So there is a particular tree called frankincense that grows in the Arabian Peninsula, and sources that they had and the control over the trade routes in the Arabian Peninsula, they were able to amass lots of wealth. Their location in the Arabian Peninsula also exposed them to lots of surrounding cultures, including the Hellenistic Greeks, who were their neighbors over to the west. Interestingly, when you look at the architecture of the Nabataans, a lot of it is very clearly based off of the architecture that we see in Hellenistic Greece. For example, we see Corinthian columns over here in Alcasne, or the Treasury. We see pediments. We see kind of like these little relief sculptures of gods and goddesses. There's also a lot of influence from Persia as well as ancient Egypt. So there's kind of like a crucible of influence that is happening in Nabatean art and architecture. So Petra was one of these cities that was one of those central hubs for the Nabataans along this trade route. It pretty much framed the Arabian Peninsula, kind of like going around the perimeter more or less. There are over 500 rock-cut tombs for royalty built into the sandstone cliffs. This is one of them right here. It's speculated that this was built for a king, but there's also several other kind of like smaller, lower-grade tombs that have been cut. Here's an example of a couple of them right here. So this is the Treasury, or Alcasne. This is one of the more famous constructions in Petra. It was featured in an Indiana Jones movie. I believe it was the place where the Holy Grail was located, if I recall correctly. This is a tomb that is cut directly into the cliffs. So the Nabataeans were just like, we're going to carve a building into the surface of this giant rock, and then they did it. So there's actually like an interior space in here, and a lot of other constructions from Petra that you can actually go inside, and there's like a hall where you can eat and stuff. So it's an incredible amount of work and an incredible feat of architecture that they basically created these buildings using subtractive sculpture. So, of course, we have this influence of Hellenistic Greek building. I mentioned previously the columns and then the pediments. Interestingly, here on the second level, the pediment is broken in the middle, and we have this tholos, or kind of circular building, right here in the center. So this is very Hellenistic. You'll recall that the Hellenistic Greeks were just kind of like blending lots of different architecture things together to create new structures. Specifically, when you look at the figures that are depicted in these little niches, there's a couple of them that are depicting Greek and Roman gods and figures. There's a couple of Amazons towards the top right here. Interestingly, there are also Egyptian and Assyrian gods that are depicted, or kind of like hybridized versions of them. This is the Great Temple right here, or this is what it's been called. There's actually some evidence that this might have been an apadana or an audience hall. There were actually some stone benches that were found in the area that suggest that this was supposed to be like an area where people were eating rather than praying. There have also been several other temples discovered in this massive Petra complex that suggests that this was probably used for something else. So the columns in this particular structure were created by stacking carved rock discs on top of one another. So you can see that a lot of the columns are still there, kind of in pieces. This was kind of like a more ideal construction because you could build the stones on top of one another. So this particular so-called Great Temple actually flanks an area that was once covered in gardens and pools. So the Nabataans actually had the technology to make fountains, which is astounding considering this was more than 2,000 years ago. So the Nabataans certainly had complex water collection and management systems, which was especially essential in the desert. This is a map showing the extent of the constructions that are present in the Petra complex. Al-Khazneh is right here. This is typically where like a lot of people enter the Petra complex right here. It's one of the more famous buildings. Here's another view of the so-called Great Temple. I encourage you to take a look at the human figures to give you a sense of scale as to how large these structures are. Interestingly, when you look at the individual kind of design elements and motifs of this complex, you'll see a lot of evidence of those kind of like blending cultures. For example, we have this column right here, and you can actually see elephant heads on either side.